Well, good morning. It's good to see each of you. We're continuing our study in the book of Revelation, and we almost got finished with chapter 8. I had a point of application I wanted you all to think about, and then we really needed to just introduce chapter 9. So, remember we looked at the 4 trumpets last time, and one of the trumpets that we looked at, there was a falling star, and it poisoned the waters because the star's name was Wormwood. And I think it's a good point for us to pause and just think about a bit of application. The Bible does talk about repeatedly using like wormwood and bitterness kind of interchangeably, the idea that wormwood would create bitterness or make things bitter. And in fact, in Deuteronomy 29:18, where it talks about the root of bitterness, it actually uses the word for wormwood there. But here in the Greek version, when Hebrews references this is in chapter 12, it calls it the root of bitterness. So he says that we need to look carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Lest there become a fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. So the idea that bitterness, the root of bitterness, is something that's dangerous to us. How do we avoid this? And so I'd like for you to think about how does, just as a way to answer this question, let's ask another question. How does bitterness consume a person? How does it destroy them? Well, I think Hebrews 12 does a good job of pointing to Esau. What did Esau do? He had this tremendous blessing, this birthright, that was something that was extremely unusual, extremely special, that brought him in line with Abraham, Isaac, and he would have been the next patriarch. All right, through whom the blessing would come. So all the messianic blessings, the ancestry, that was what was in his grasp. That's what he had a hold of. But all he could think about was how hungry he was in that moment. And that's what consumed him. That's all he could think about. And so he gave up his birthright for a bowl of stew. Now, that also, if you think about it, showed a lack of faith as well. He thought he was going to die. Now, wait a minute. He didn't have any kids, and this blessing was coming through him. He was not going to die. By virtue of faith, he should have known that. But again, he turned his back on that and focused on what he did not have. So, bitterness, what we see from this is bitterness often comes from looking at what we don't have instead of focusing on what we do have. And that's what I want you to think about. So, with that thought in mind, it is true that each one of us have struggles that we have to deal with, whether it's temptations or trials or just things that plague us as far as things that we wish were not so. So they are unique. Proverbs 14:10 talks about how no heart knows the misery of another person. To a certain extent, we are limited with how much we can share with each other. Each person kind of in the end, bears their own burden, their own misery alone, even though it is shared with other people. But it's the devil that makes us think that we are somehow struggling with some misery, some trial, some temptation that is more excessive than anybody else. In fact, and then this is the suggestion, that maybe it's so excessive that you're excused for not being able to overcome it. And so 1 Corinthians 13:10 is very helpful. 10:13. I don't know why I keep reversing those. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is very helpful here because it says that God is faithful. He's not going to allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. He will always provide a way of escape. And he tells us we're not tempted with anything that is not common to man. So again, we are unique, but we are not so unique to give us excuse to think that we are excused from overcoming the trials that are before us. So don't let yourself be kind of pulled into that trap. And again, going back to this idea of bitterness and thinking that others have something that we don't have, Ephesians 4:31-32 tells us to put away all bitterness, all wrath, all clamoring, all anger, are looking at other people, seeing what they have that we don't have, leads to bitterness and then this fighting amongst each other. So this is something that we're supposed to put away. I think John 21:18, here at the end of the Gospel of John, is very helpful because after Jesus tells Peter, you're going to die for me. You're going to be a martyr. Peter then turns and obviously is not really excited about this news and not really excited about this thought. And he looks at John and he says, well, what about him? And Jesus' answer is, if my desire is for him to stay till I come again, then so be it. You serve me. That's not your concern. You focus on your service to me. So we have to be careful that we don't become distracted by what other people have. And instead, what we need to do is we need to focus on the blessings that we do have. At the end of the day, that is bitterness's trap. It's getting us to focus on what we don't have and lose sight and devalue the things that we do have. So we have to deliberately do the opposite. We have to focus on the things that we do have and appreciate the value of them. Acts 8:19 through 24. I just went blank. The guy there, yes, Simon the sorcerer, thank you. So Peter says that he saw that he was in the gall of bitterness. It's our word there for bitterness. It's the same thing. That was Simon's problem as well. He had just received salvation, but what was the only thing he could think about? Ooh, if I have that, if I have the power to give miracles to other people, I can get rich. That's all he could think about. And he lost sight of what he had recently received. All right, so 2 Timothy 3:2 talks about unthankfulness being one of the key characteristics of the failing generation. So we got to make sure that we're being thankful for what we do have, the blessings that we do have, focusing on those. And I'll reference Stephen's recent sermon. We also, in trials, they're not easy, they're not in and of themselves joyous, but if we, again, by faith, if we look to what those trials produce, that enables us to count them as joy because we're looking ahead to the blessing and the reward that comes from them and that comes afterwards. All right, so these are the things that whenever I'm faced with the temptation of being upset at what other people have, falling into bitterness myself, this is what I have to think about. How about you? What other thoughts do you all have?
Making sure your goal is something that's eternal. If your goal is something physical, like short term, if you don't end up achieving that goal, you're going to become very bitter and start looking for reasons why you didn't get it. That's not going to lead good places.
Yep, very good point. So we got to make sure that our goal, people often say in goal setting, it has to be something that's achievable. Otherwise, you're just bringing disappointment on yourself. So earthly goals may not be achievable. And at the end, even if we achieve them, they're not going to bring the final satisfaction. So think about what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 3. God said eternity in our heart. Nothing else is going to satisfy except for God himself. Everything else is going to lead to bitterness, even if we do manage to achieve it. Any other thoughts?
I think a lot of times bitterness, sometimes it is just about what's happened to you. You can think like, why me, or something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it's associated with other people. Why do they have it and I don't?
Yep.
And so I think a lot of it can come from a lack of love for other people. Learning to revoice what those revoice.
Yeah. Excellent point. Excellent point. All right. Very good. All right. So let's wrap up the chapter here. So at the very end of this chapter of 8, we're introduced to this flying angel, or I think New American Standards and the Nestle's text uses the word eagle there. So what is associated with each of the 3 remaining trumpet blasts? They were considered what? What did he call them? Well, I've already got the answer in the title, don't I? And I looked and I heard an angel, or as I said, New American Standard is going to have eagle, flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpets of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So the last 3 trumpet blasts, each one of them is a woe. So these are obviously trumpet blasts that are going to be, even though the first 4 were severe, these are going to be more severe than the ones that we've seen up to this point. So eagle, I think, is very appropriate. By the way, this is the same word that's used in Matthew 24:28, where Jesus is looking ahead to the destruction of Jerusalem. It says, where you see the eagles, there will be the destruction there. And then Luke 17:37 is parallel to that. So each of these woes are going to be so severe, or each of these remaining blasts are going to be so severe, they'll be considered woes. I liked Harkrider's comment in his commentary. he says that historians agree that three major factors contributed to Rome's demise: natural calamity, internal rottenness, and outside invasion. It seems these three areas are symbolized first in the warning sounds of the trumpets, and again, but more completely, in the outpouring of God's wrath from the seven bowls which are yet to be revealed. So, in the first four, a lot of people see these natural disasters. I don't think, as we've seen, I don't think when he's talking about trees and grass and the sea that he's talking about literal things. We've been symbolic all the way up to this point. And so I think it's a mistake to think that when we see those references in the first four trumpets that they are also, that now all of a sudden it's become literal. I think natural calamity is certainly a part of that and could be included, but I really like the idea of the internal rottenness and outside invasion. I think we're going to see that in those next two trumpets that we're about to look at. That's going to be the focus of those. And natural calamity being included, but more than just that in the first four that we've looked at. All right, so with that, let's look at the first two woes. Again, this is going to be trumpets 5 and 6. So as we get into chapter 9, what is the source of the first woe? And then what does this communicate to us? What does this represent?
This bottomless pit that the star fell and the key to the bottomless pit was given to it. And the smoke came out and like locusts came out of it.
Yeah, very good. So the source that we see is this bottomless pit. So the fifth angel sounded. I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. Some commentators make an interesting point. He doesn't see the star fall. It already has fallen. It's by the time we see this, it has already fallen. To him, all right, so the star is clearly representing a person, a being of some kind. So, because to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke, locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. So the bottomless pit, or it's often called the abyss, is associated with the realm of the dead, perdition. So Romans 10:7 talks about that us having to go into the abyss or into the pit to retrieve salvation. We don't have to do that. And then in Revelation 11:7 and then 17:8, we're also going to see that this was the place where the devil is ultimately cast to, and also associated with that. So Luke 8:31, there the demons asked Jesus not to torment them, not to send them into the abyss or to this bottomless pit. And as I mentioned in chapter 20, we're going to see that the devil is later cast there. So given the fact that this source of all of this trouble is coming from the bottomless pit, that makes us think that this is somehow, in some way, related to the devil himself, demons, or any kind of forces coming from this place. So, who's the fallen star? It could be a ruler, like we looked at in chapter 8, where the idea of there's this star that fell and that brought bitterness on all the waters, poisoned the waters. That could be a tremendous, persecuting, idolatrous, unjust ruler that's doing terrible things to the nation. Could be that, or it could be a reference to the devil himself. Luke 10:18 talks about the devil falling like lightning, Jesus seeing that. In Revelation 12, we're going to get there in a bit, we're going to also see that the devil is cast out of heaven. So there's precedence for thinking that this could be the devil. But regardless, whatever this is something that ultimately is going to affect the earth dwellers, not Christians themselves. So keep that in mind as we go through. All right, what effect did it have on the elements? Is this literal? If not, what does it mean? So we've talked about this before, so I'm going to race through it. Smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, so the sun and the air were darkened. So obviously this is emphasizing, dramatic effect for what's happening. But we've talked about this in chapter 6. We saw this with what looked like the end of the world. This is the same kind of language that's being associated here. The only thing new here is the great furnace. And if I remember correctly, when Moses was doing either the plague of the lice or the flies, I thought he got like ashes or something and threw them up into the air. And then that also happens in Ezekiel. It's going to either be 9 or 10, where one of the cherubim go and pull ashes out and throw them. So, associated with the idea of judgment, destruction, but also the blocking of light. Obviously, there's a symbolic meaning there. So the sun's being blocked out, and so there's a loss of direction, misdirection, if you will, that is going to be part of the tools that the devil's going to use. So most people, or no, I shouldn't say most people, there's a group of people that look at this and see unseen things, demon possession and things like that. I think that's a mistake because we're talking about things that are visible, not invisible. Not saying there's not demonic forces involved, but these are not entirely invisible things. So if we're losing this light, if we're losing this hope, this guidance, the wisdom that's associated with it, it's got to be something that we see. Otherwise, when it's taken away, then it's not going to affect us. So I think this is an indication that this is acting through people and that they are reflecting this, that the one either opening this pit is in some way human himself, even though he may be influenced by demonic forces, obviously. All right, so let's talk about what came out of the pit. What do you think is the significance of each of the attributes of these creatures? And then also gave you the tip. Make sure you compared this to Joel 2 as well. So what comes out of the pit? What do you think of each of their features? Let's just start with what comes out, just a rough description. Locusts, all right, very good. Are these ordinary locusts? No, not for lots of reasons. All right, so here's the text. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. I don't know any locusts like that. The torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold. That's important. And their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth, and they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men for 5 months. So locusts are often used in association with God's judgment on other nations. So the most obvious one is we're going to think about the 8th plague. So the judgment that God issued against Egypt in Exodus 10. But in Deuteronomy 28:38 and also in 2 Chronicles 7:13, God warns in the second giving of the law, and then also at the establishment of the temple in response to Solomon's prayer, that if the people did not obey, one of the plagues that would come upon them was locusts. So this was not just associated with the Egyptian, but this was a tool that God used, even though there's precedent in the original establishment there in Exodus 10. And Psalm 105 is a back reference back to Exodus 10. All right, so shouldn't be a surprise then to see this as being something of like a national judgment. But I think the most powerful help is the one that comes from Joel 1 and 2. So the book starts with what the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten, what the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. So again, notice this kind of like just cascading judgment in coming in incremental form, but kind of piecemeal, all being destroyed. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. And then he goes on, a nation has come up against my land, strong without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion. He has the fangs of a fierce lion. He's laid waste. He describes it again, notice the similarity, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. He talks about a fire devouring before them. The flame behind them burns. They leave a wilderness behind. Their appearance are like horses, like swift steeds, so they run with the noise of like chariots. Over the mountaintops they leap like the noise of a flaming fire. They run like mighty men. They crawl the wall like men of war. They march in formation. They do not break ranks. They do not push one another. Even one marches in his own column. They lunge between the weapons, can't cut them down. They're everywhere in the city, the wall. They climb into the houses. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. The Lord gives his voice before his army. The day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? So this description here is actually of literal locusts. That was the problem that Joel was following. That's what had happened to the Israelites. And he was the messenger coming behind them, calling them to repentance in the wake of this destruction that had come before them and could potentially come again upon them soon. So that threat was also before them. So, what do we learn from this? First of all, this use of symbols is not unique. This is something that was applied to a natural force. So if we saw it applied again in Revelation, if that's what it's talking about, that would be acceptable. That would be something that we have precedent for. Nothing new or unique there. So just putting this before us, so you see in Revelation the different characteristics that are here. And in Joel we have a lot of the same characteristics, not the exact same. And in fact, the last few, the nation without number, devouring the land by fire, the organization, not being able to stop them getting into everything, I think that's one of the primary points of this reference back to Joel 1 and 2 with these symbols, is these are things of your nightmares. These are the worst possible cases. This is something that cannot be stopped, and nobody is going to be able to prevent it from kind of getting everywhere, if you will. So, kind of the reaction in Joel 1, I believe, is the reaction that people are supposed to have in Revelation 9 as well. As this is something that's supposed to be fearful. Again, it should be something that's supposed to warn them. So, we've talked about these elements, I think most of them before. The sun and the air darken. The power to torture, this idea of torment. It could have, again, a couple different ideas. Matthew 8:6 has to do with demon possession, but 2 Peter 2:8 talks about Lot tormenting his soul, seeing the unrighteous deed. So it's not just peculiar to demon possession. So obviously the idea of horses being strong, fast, enduring, kind of the highest level of war machines and dealing with that. And Jeremiah 12:5 talking about, again, if you can't keep up with the footmen, how are you going to keep up with the horses? So the gold-like crowns, they don't have these victory crowns. They have something that appears like victory crowns. So they are inherently deceitful. They have the idea that, look, we're going to win. We have won, but they have not. So their crowns look like gold. It's something that also reminds us from Hebrews about the passing pleasures of sin. Something that looks like one thing, but then you find out later that it's not. I think maybe the idea of men's faces and women's hair, these are not animals. These are things that are intelligent, they're smart, they're strong, they're cunning, but yet they're also appealing and beautiful and charming. So the lion's teeth, we think about that just being very voracious, aggressive. Galatians 5:15 talks about be careful that if you bite and devour one another that you don't consume each other. So again, we don't have to always think of this kind of language and the application being something that is like this external creature or this external soldier. It's something that we can develop ourselves and that we can become ourselves. So obviously the breastplates of iron, very difficult to defeat and to resist. The overwhelming sound, the intimidating sound. And then I think the idea of their tails being like scorpions. And later we're going to see a similar army that has snakes in their tails. In both of these cases, I think the idea is first of all, it's not the first attack, right? It's something, there's kind of an unexpected back, a second attack that comes. And then when it does attack, the damage is not immediate, like, getting bit by a snake or stung by a scorpion. Sure, it hurts, but it's the poison they leave behind that has the ongoing effects and the ongoing damage to the person. So, interestingly, Ezekiel 2:6, God speaks to Ezekiel there and says that you are in a land of scorpions. Do not be afraid of their reaction. He uses scorpions to refer to the people of Judah that were carried away into Babylonian captivity. Again, the point I keep making, going back to, this doesn't have to be an animal. It can be a human being. All right, so I'll pass over those other passages as well, but I think probably James 3:8 is probably the next most powerful one, the idea of like the demonic wisdom and then people again. Oh no, James 3:8 is going to be a reference to the tongue being set on fire by the nature of hell. So again, the idea that how we talk, how we speak, we can use this to hurt each other, we can deceive each other. It's often used in treachery, presenting ourselves as one thing, but in the end being something else. All of these are, I think, very well pictured by the idea of there's an appearance of one thing, maybe the face of the woman, and then having the tail of the scorpion or the snake, something that's very appealing, but in the end there is a unforeseen attack that often comes and catches us unaware and has lasting consequences from this. So again, just precedents for people being described as snakes and scorpions and being treacherous in this way. So Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 58 and the Psalm 140 also, I think, have to play with this. All right, any questions about this before we leave this question? Or thoughts or comments?
It's just interesting to me how much scorpions come up in this chapter. I hadn't thought of that as like a classic biblical image, but you just referenced earlier Luke 10:18 about I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven.
Mm-hmm.
The very next thing that Jesus says to the disciples there is, "Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions, over all the power of the enemy. Nothing shall by any means hurt you." So it's almost like serpent obviously is kind of a classic, illustration of the enemy, and scorpions is right there with it.
Yep.
I just didn't remember that.
Yep. That's a really good reference. So I won't try to repeat that for the sake of the recording. I think you said it well. But again, it's also interesting, even in that case, Christ gives his apostles power over these things. And again, these creatures are also going to be ones that are not going to be able to hurt Christians. They're going to be limited in this way. So there may be another level of similarity also there, even though I think he's obviously talking about literal scorpions and serpents like what happened to Paul. But that is very good imagery to borrow from. All right, so keep answering my own questions. Who was their target? What can we learn from this? All right, so you know the target. The target was not Christians. So what can we learn from this?
It seems like it's intended to make people repent.
Yep. So goal is, again, targeting those that are wicked. And as we've seen several times, and we're going to continue to see, this should be a motivation. This should be a driver to cause them to repent. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So, obviously these are not natural locusts, because what do locusts attack? Green things. And these things are actually steered away from that and instead steered toward those who are unbelievers. And obviously it's not a natural disaster as well, because natural disasters are going to affect everybody, believer and unbeliever alike. So this is something that is in some way, there is a spiritual edge to this that makes it where it can only target those who are unbelievers. I'll pause also here and just notice the contrast. Not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those who don't have the seal of God. Now, what does green trees and grass have to do with those in the seal of God? I think this may be one of the clues that we get to where we've been seeing the sea and the earth and the green trees. Again, we're not talking about literal things. I think there may be a reference, and I'm still kind of working through and thinking this, but I think this is one of the strongest passages to suggest that the idea of the grass, the green things, the fruitful trees are associated with God's people here. And that's how they appear in this symbol. But again, take that with a massive grain of salt. I'm still kind of working and thinking about it. But I think this is one of the strongest passages to suggest that we're not supposed to be thinking, because the contrast of these green things are those who don't have the seal of God. So anyway, just something to think about. But main point is, again, as we've seen before, it's very comforting. This should be reassuring that, first of all, God does make a distinction, as we've seen before, and we can also avoid some of the punishment, some of the torment that is going to come because it's associated with sin. And as long as we're not partaking in that, then we'll be able to avoid some of those things that are associated with that. So I think Romans 1:27 to 28 is a good example of this, of the fall of the Gentiles that's described there. And in their insistent sin, it says that they received in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. So the spiritual degradation, as well as the physical impacts, the psychological impacts, emotional impacts of sin, all of these things Christians will be able to bypass because they won't be partaking in this sin. So I think this is probably the best explanation for that. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on that before we leave it? Just thinking about the target.
I kind of think of from the Old Testament when God sent hornets to torment and drive out the Canaanites, and these hornets only affected the Canaanites, but it was also another chance for them to repent, kind of like Rahab did before the people of Israel came in and completely wiped them out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another good illustration of that, God using the hornets to drive the people out but not destroy them, giving them simultaneously an opportunity to repent. Good thought. All right, so how long did they afflict men? What might this mean? First the what, and then the why, or the meaning. How long did they afflict?
5 months.
5 months, all right. They were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months, and they would seek death and not be able to find it. So, makes me think about God's instruction to the devil in dealing with Job, is that all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. And again, in chapter 2:6, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So it seems that these forces, in a similar kind of way, are interrupted, they are restrained by God. And so I think the 5 months is similar to what we saw about the parable of the virgins, the 5 wise and the 5 foolish. This is the breaking of the 10. Again, this is a reference to God's restraining this torment, it being interrupted by God. And again, going back to 1 Corinthians 10:13, there is a way of escape. So God is still kind of restraining this, and so they have an opportunity again to repent. They have a way to escape at this point, even though this is a very terrible torment. So a lot of commentators will mention that this also happens to be about the time of how long a locust would live. So again, thinking of this in symbolic terms, I don't see a lot of value in that, but it is an interesting kind of coincidence. And you could still make the same point. This is for a limited time, the lifetime of a bug, right? So the same idea being that God's torment of these people is for a little while. It's not forever. This is something that that is allowed to basically be a torment. Some people say like hell on earth. Maybe that's a good description of how extreme this torment is. All right. Any thoughts on this one or questions? All right, so let's talk about their king. Who's their king and how is he their king?
The angel of the bottomless pit.
All right, and what names are given to him?
Hebrew, Adam, but in Greek, Lion.
All right, and both of those words it's basically the Hebrew for destroyer or destruction, and then the Greek for destruction as well. And they has king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek has the name Apollyon. So these are things that we see throughout, going again back to our Old Testament precedent. Hell and destruction are before the Lord, Proverbs 15:11. Hell and destruction, this is the Abaddon, are never full, Proverbs 27:20. Job mentions them in 28:22 about destruction and death being parallels. But John 8:44 talks about Jesus speaking of the Jews, saying, "You're of your father the devil." Why? Because you have the same desire and you have the same actions. The desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. All right, so what lie did he use to murder at the beginning? So go back to Genesis 3, right? When he spoke to Eve and he lied to her and deceived her, and what was the result of that? Well, sin, spiritual death, but even physical death came as a result of that as well. So the idea being is that he is very closely associated with destruction. Other thought being that destroyer is the polar opposite of creator, which is what God is. Isaiah 40:28 and then Romans 1:25 all speak about God being our creator. And so this spirit this being has is the exact opposite intention. His desire is to destroy, and his actions are to destroy, where God is trying to create and trying to build. So I think this is a reference to the devil or those influenced him. John 8:44, we've got 13:2. That's where it says that the devil, having entered Judas's heart, then prompted him to go out and to betray. So the idea being that the devil does have influence over the people who give themselves to him to do his will. All right. He says, one woe is past. Behold, still two more woes are coming after these things. What might this woe represent? What are these locusts? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to push forward on this. So I don't think this is a reference to demon possession, because we're told in Zechariah 13 this is something that would have ended with the Messianic age, along with inspiration and prophecy as well. Luke 10, I believe, is the passage that you brought up just a second ago, Andrew. So I think what this is probably a reference to is that people can, as I said earlier, as much as they give themselves over to the devil to do his will, to follow his desires, whether it's consciously or not, whether they have the same mission, the same objective, then he can use them. James 3:14-16 talks about the wisdom that is from beneath, all right, demonic wisdom. The biting and the devouring, the seeking dominion over each other. And then 2 Corinthians 11:13-15 talks about apostles who transform themselves as angels of light, but they are actually the devil's emissaries. They are his servants. And then 1 Timothy 4:1 talks about those that in the end times that would give themselves over to the doctrine of demons. So the teaching that originates from demons as well. So I think this can apply in lots of different ways. All the ways that people give themselves over to sin, to the devil, to do his will, become corrupt. That creates a hell on earth, if you will. And so this can apply in lots of different ways. But I thought Proverbs 30:11-17 was particularly applicable. He says, there is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There's our unthankfulness. There's a generation that's pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness, so it's blind. There's a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, the arrogance. Their eyelids are lifted up. There's a generation whose teeth are like swords. Sound familiar? And whose fangs are like knives. To devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. The leech has two daughters, give and give. There are three things that are never satisfied, four never say enough. The eye that mocks its father and scorns obedience to his mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it. So I think this is just one example of internal rottenness, internal or destruction that's going to come from just the moral rottenness and the breakdown of society. This is just one possible way that that's going to happen. All right, next time we will get into the second woe and the four angels being bound up at Euphrates, and what could that possibly mean. So I look forward to spending that time with you next time. Again, appreciate your participation and your preparation as well. Goodbye.